Welcome, everyone. I am Traci Fenton, founder and CEO of World Blue, coming to you from Florida, East Coast, Florida. And I'm so excited to be with you. And I'm so excited to have my special guest. You all know him, the man, the myth, the legend, Ricardo Semler, CEO of Semco and author of the best-selling books, Maverick and the 7-Day Weekend. Hello, Ricardo. I know you're muted. Yay. You can unmute. That's fine. You can unmute. We were just talking beforehand.
That's the big phrase of last year, which is unmute, please. And I can recognize several people actually that I know. Some people who ended up in places that I didn't know, Gothenburg and Portugal. It's wonderful to do this with. It's very late for some people, I can tell where they are, but it's still a wonderful opportunity to talk. And I've been doing very little to nothing of these talks, so it's always fun to do one again because I've been avoiding it like the plague, but it's fun to do again with certain groups. Otherwise, it's gotten very repetitive over the years, and I've stopped repeating myself. And I'm working on a new book about the effects on us of over achievement and the overrated aspects of success. So that I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Well, we're so excited that you're here. And so we're so excited that each and every one of you are here. We had hundreds and hundreds of people show up for this webinar. We know some of you are going to catch it on the replay, but we're so glad you're here. And if you're watching the replay, it's great to have you here as well. So here's the plan for our time together. We're going to be together for about 90 minutes. We know some of you are going to have to come and go. That's totally fine. We get it. But what we're going to do is spend about an hour, and Ricardo and I are going to share a bunch of ideas with you about these concepts that we all know and love: organizational democracy, self-management, freedom at work. We're going to talk through a bunch of ideas and tactics for how to make this work in your organization and share stories. I'll be talking, and then Ricardo will come in. He'll jump in with his insights and inspiration. And Ricardo, we're so glad to have you back. We know you've kind of come out of the cave, as we say at World Blue, to come and join us. And we're so very honored and excited to have you here. I have to tell you all the quick backstory of how this day came to be. I actually started my company, World Blue, 26 years ago when I was just 21 years old and a senior in college. And I was at it going, gosh, is anyone else thinking about these ideas of freedom and democracy in the workplace? There's got to be somebody else doing this. And it wasn't until I was about 25 years old that I read the book that I'm sure many of you on this webinar have read, which is Ricardo Semler's book, Maverick. And when I read Maverick, it's like lighting a fire under your seat. I was, oh my gosh, this guy's doing it. This company is doing it. This is so exciting. And I don't know if Ricardo remembers this or not, but I wrote him an email when I was 25 years old. This is now 21 years ago, so you can do the math. And told you what I was up to starting World Blue. And Ricardo wrote me back such a beautifully encouraging note. And it just meant the world to me. Thank you, Ricardo, for that. And we've stayed in touch a little bit through email. Of course, he's been very busy and we've been busy too. And then when Semco Style Institute started, we were able to develop a great friendship with SSI. And I know many of you on the webinar are from SSI as well as the World Blue community. Some of you are just meeting me for the first time and some of you are just meeting Ricardo for the first time. It was then just a few years ago in our friendship with Semco Style Institute that I became good friends with Daphne. So Daphne, if you're watching, thank you, lady, for all you've done for bringing us together. At World Blue and at Semco Style Institute, we have an abundance mentality. We believe that we are better collaborating together than we are apart. And that's why we're so thrilled that Ricardo is going to be keynoting at our upcoming Freedom at Work Summit, and that he agreed to also come on and do this webinar so that we could really bring our communities together to talk about these very important ideas and what they mean for our world. So Ricardo, thank you again so much for being on. After our hour together, we are going to have about roughly 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. So please be prepared with your questions during our Q&A. We very much look forward to answering them. Now with that, Ricardo, I'd love to have you introduce yourself briefly to the community. Many of us know the story, but some of us don't know about the incredible Semco story and your books and what you've done from there, inspiring a global movement. So please tell us a little bit more about you.
The 5-minute version is that uh, I think a lot of what my thinking comes from is the years, about 10 years that I spent in a rock band, actually, from 14 to 20, a little bit. And, you find when you think about Paul McCartney without the Beatles or Mick Jagger without the Rolling Stones, and you realize, of course, that there's something about the synergy of doing something collectively, which is impossible to emulate on your own, no matter how much talent you have. And I think it became clear when I arrived at a small manufacturing company that my father had as an immigrant that he had started in Brazil that made pumps for ships. And I was very shocked at seeing the way all the controls were in place and people were searched when they left the company, and how they were very structured in a very exact box and hierarchy, et cetera. And I started thinking about that, and I said, boy, that's a tremendous jump. Why can't we try and do something here the same way as we would in a band, and find out whether people won't show up on their own, won't produce on their own if left to their own devices, and if we would remove all of what seemed like boarding school restrictions to me. And so we started pulling at these one at a time, saying, what would happen if people could come within a rate, well, a window of an hour or so, come anytime they want, and then 2 hours and 3 hours, and then completely free. And we had an assembly line, and we realized that, of course, these are adults that know themselves that the assembly line won't move if they don't show up at the same time. And so I think over time, it became clear that we could count on the adult side of people and remove boarding school aspects. And we started playing with things, taking away control over expense accounts, over how many hours the person worked per week. And this went on and on for many years. And we slowly started realizing that if we weren't transparent about our numbers, what we're trying to do, et cetera, we could never really get people to buy in. And if they could not participate, if these people were not able to participate in decisions that reverted decisions that we'd like to make, or were definitely in a different direction than I would have made or somebody else would have made, until that really happens, I think people don't really trust the system or the idea that they can that they have this influence. And they'll be back to some cliches about, we want to be participatory, we want people to chime in, but in essence, in the end, it's the board that decides. And we started opening this up a little bit at one point by leaving 2 seats open at every board meeting for the first 2 employees that walked in, and they had the same vote as all of the constituted directors. And that, for the first time, I think, started breaking down this idea that the board will ultimately decide and we'll just hear your opinions. It's very tiring for employees to be called upon to participate all the time, and knowing that the final word is not going to respect what was said there. And so we started this whole process. We started making sure that people were at meetings if they wanted to. So we'd say the meeting is at 4:15 in room 11, and you show up if you want. And if you're bored, just go. Don't stay in the meeting board, and we'll see who's left. And if nobody's left who wants to take care of the customer's problem, that's something we'd rather know, and try to understand why it is that when we say, look, this has to be fixed by Friday, and there's no one left in the meeting, we know that it doesn't ring a bell there either. So I think if we did that, then we started going every time further in the direction of letting people determine, of course, their own title, their own working process, and then, of course, at a point, their own salary. And that generated a completely different company that went then from 100 to about 5,000 people in 14 different places. And we got to a point where we didn't know if anybody was working at all because they could go to any of the 14 offices. They could stay home. And I had fun with this pandemic thing because people told us in 1981 that there was no such thing as people working at home. It was impossible. And people used telex machines. And I think I see a few gray hairs here that might remember the telex machine, but this was before the fax. And this was a 60-kilo big cast iron machine, and which you had to learn how to operate. And so we did little courses on that, and we sent people telex machines to their houses. So people had telex machines in their house so they could work at home. So we weren't surprised at the pandemic that 40 years later, people learned how to work at home very quickly. So we were basically, I think, testing and poking the system to say, what happens if you remove all the constraints and say, what is it that you do best? Where do you want to do this? With what title? Making how much money? Working how many hours a week? And then when we were at 5,000 people, I knew very little about the company or the products or the new things that were coming up because it was completely hands off. And people were basically on a 6-month rotating budget in which they would also anonymously put together the people they need, anonymously put the name of the boss that they think would work for them, or doing this from below evaluation anonymously, whether that leader should remain. So basically, I think we went from the starting point of trying to test the idea of removing these obstacles, and then came to scale, which is, I think, one of the big issues and culturally too, because then we started having companies in several places around the world, completely different cultures. We then took this to schools. We now have schools which have the exact same rationale, but we have schools in Baghdad, in Africa, in California, in Brazil, and so forth. And the idea that people, in the beginning, people would say, yeah, but I can see this with 100 people. Would it work with 200 or 500? Well, it worked fine with 5,000. So that kind of did away with that issue. Does it work better? There was no issue there. We had about a 2.5% turnover rate of personnel in a 20-year period. The business was way above our competitors in terms of the key indicators. So I don't think there's any issues. I think the issue is really, will people take the leap of faith that is involved in understanding that by removing constraints and restrictions from people, you get the very best of them, and then you decide what to do with that. And the illusion of control is still very strong, I think, in everyone. We have a very strong military and then religious background of how to organize. And it is very low intellect. I mean, it seems it does a lot for the self-illusion and the self-esteem of people who are theoretically at the top, and they're top. That's the big question as well. But they're there because they know how to deal with a controlled atmosphere. But the idea that is better, or that people are happier in that situation, or that is even more sustainable over time, is very silly. If you take the stock market companies of 1929, 49, 1989, 2000, now all of these years in which there was 2008, you realize that very few companies survive either on their own, in the same format as they were before, or that didn't either go bankrupt or get sold or get merged, et cetera, et cetera. And so the system itself is also an illusion, because if you go look at the numbers of survival of these big companies, they don't really survive over a 20, 30-year period anyway. So it's not that works well, therefore, or that war works well and military is wonderful and see how it solves everything and goes out there and solves something quickly. It doesn't. And the messes that everybody gets into in military, in religions, in work, prove that the idea of controlling from the top is a silly idea that really just caters to a human insecurity of wanting to feel you're in control. That's about it, Traci.
That's exactly it, Ricardo. Well, it's always inspirational to hear your story. And I know many of us on the webinar can identify with and appreciate many of the reasons why you believe in this approach that we're talking about today. And I absolutely love hearing those points. And we're going to get deeper into it. So I'm going to share now my story of how I came to be on this journey and how we, of course, are here together now with a shared interest in taking people out of command and control hierarchies that I love how you said create that illusion of control and into a much more democratic structure. For me, it started, I grew up in Iowa. I'm a daughter of 2 teachers, and I was blessed to grow up in a great home. And I have a distinct memory of being 10 years old and in 4th grade. And when everyone would go out on the playground to play dodgeball and kickball and swing from the bars, I was by the back fence taking one-on-one coaching appointments with my fellow 10-year-olds, teaching them about how they can achieve their fullest potential in life. So I was a very odd child in a lot of different ways. And from that point on, I just always knew that I wanted to be about my work in life was meant to be about helping to release the fullest potential of each and every individual. And all this kind of came together right for the summer before my senior year in college. I was asked by our college president if I would be the director of our student affairs conference. It was the oldest student affairs conference in the country. So it was a bit of an honor at my small liberal arts school. And I said, sure, I'll do it. I'll be the director. And I got together a team of students who were my friends to figure out how we were going to do this conference and what topic we were going to do the conference on. And again, I said to them, you know what, let's do the conference on something that's very consciousness raising and outside the box and forward thinking and brings out the best in everyone. And they said, great, Traci, we'll go away. We'll do some research. Let's come back in the fall and we'll pitch you on our idea. I said, fine. So they came back in the fall. We took ourselves very seriously. We met up in the president's conference room. And I said, all right, guys, what do you got? What do you have, friends, of what we're going to do this conference on? And they said, drum roll, let's do the conference on democracy. And I had a very not politically correct moment. And my first thought was, democracy is old white guys in politics in Washington, D.C. And I don't want anything to do with it. That just sounds boring. It doesn't sound like anything that I talked about that was forward thinking and consciousness raising and out of the box. And I just was like, guys, I think that's kind of a bad idea. And they said, you know what, we want you to understand that there is a different side to democracy. Democracy doesn't necessarily mean politics. It doesn't mean voting. It doesn't mean Washington, D.C. It's actually a style of leadership. And when they said that, something just really clicked for me. And I started to think about it. And as I was listening to them, and I thought about my purpose in life, which I know is to help people realize their fullest potential, I realized you can't realize your full potential in an environment of fear and that command and control hierarchy that Ricardo was just talking about. You cannot realize your fullest potential in that kind of environment. You can only realize your full potential in an environment of freedom, in an environment that releases rather than constrains you. And so what's that framework for how we get to freedom? Well, what I've since found is that it's organizational democracy. It's those principles of democracy that create the environment that allows us to fully flourish. So once all those dots connected for me, I was sold. And it was my senior year of college when I was 21 that I started World Blue. And we were off to the races. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. We've had the great privilege of working with some of the very top companies all over the world, companies you will have heard of like GE Aviation, Pandora, DaVita, Zappos, WD-40, Mind Valley, 15.5, Groupon, Glassdoor. All of these companies have gone on to become World Blue certified, freedom-centered companies. And it's just been such a privilege now to have worked with so many companies, hundreds of companies around the world, and with individual leaders teaching them how to lead with freedom over fear in 100 countries worldwide. We've been very honored to receive several recognitions, such as our Thinkers 50 Radar Award, being recognized in Inc. magazine as being a top leadership company, and other awards that are all about shifting the way we lead in the world. That's why we do what we do every day. Now, what we believe at the very core here, and what Ricardo and I are here to talk about, is the core message we want to get into with you today, which is that the traditional way of leading, that hierarchical leadership, command and control, top-down organizational design, is just quite frankly not the best model of leadership or the best model of organizational design. I think many of us know that intuitively, or we've practiced it. Some of you are very advanced in your practice of this. Some of you are coming to our webinar for the very first time hearing about these ideas. So we hope to give something to everyone, depending on whatever stage you're at in this process. But this style of leadership, it's not what World Blue is about. By the way, I didn't mention we're called World Blue because blue is universally recognized as the color of freedom. And our vision is to see a world where everyone can work in freedom rather than fear. So I think a lot of us intuitively know, yes, this is how we want to work, but how do we do it? How do we get there? And we're going to talk about that today. So this hierarchical style, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Why does it constantly fall short? And Ricardo mentioned some of those reasons. It fails to meaningfully engage employees. It dumbs employees down, and it also creates drama. I think many of us know what it's like working in these environments. Oh my gosh, the silos, the drama, the fiefdoms, the battles. It creates higher turnover. You don't attract and retain top talent. It slows problem solving down and our ability to react to change going on in our markets. And it's inefficient and bureaucratic. And there's many other reasons why this hierarchical form of leadership and organizational design falls short. So what's the alternative? Well, we believe a democratic style. Now, obviously, when I'm saying the word democracy here, I'm not talking about a political party. I'm talking about democracy, demos and kraton, meaning power to the people, or unleashing the power within people, what we like to say. So that democratic style of leadership, it excels because why? It creates higher employee engagement and meaning. It develops informed employees who work well together. It attracts and retains the very top talent. It decentralizes decision-making to respond quickly to market changes, and it's highly efficient and agile. So what we have found is that a democratic style of leadership and organizational design, rather than a hierarchical command and control top-down style of leadership and organizational design, creates the optimal conditions for growth, not just the growth of our companies or organizations or our schools, but also our personal and inner growth. And Ricardo, I just wanted to know if you want to jump in there and add anything more about why you think a more democratic and decentralized model is more effective than a hierarchical model of leadership.
Well, I think that very few people have difficulty with the idea of having a greater say in their own lives because everyone votes and chooses an app and a grocery store and a school for their kids and so forth, so that people are obviously attuned to the idea that choosing freely is a better option. Personally, I think the trouble starts when people say, but wait a second, if an organization is too free and people just do what they want, how the heck do we get together to do what needs to be done collectively? And people say, what's wrong with, I know you have a person here from Coca-Cola, says, what's wrong with Coca-Cola? And why screw with something that's been there for 100 odd years and it works? And I think that the idea that having something that is very proprietary and being able to continue to market that, produce that, et cetera, in an assembly line format is something that should work well for the shareholders. And there'll be moments and cycles and that I don't know if maybe somebody from Coke can tell us here on the chat what it would have been like to buy stock from Coke 10 and 20 years ago and how that would have done today versus just putting it on a standard S&P stock market to find out whether it's worth it. Is it worth it? This 20 years of all of this effort of Coke to put out these millions of bottles a day with all these enormous distribution problems and marketing budgets and so forth, is that much better than simply putting your money in the stock market on average and seeing what happens? And so the assumption that it will break down over time, I think, is there because if you look at the stock market, if you look at the big companies, you look at the top 1,000 over 10, 20 years, you see that the survival rate is small and that they end up merged and so forth, which is a good example. If you if you then think, what does that mean in the day to day? Because everyone is kind of amenable to the idea of democracy and freedom. It's that until it really reaches your point where you have employees who aren't telling you whether they're going to show up today at all, didn't show up at all because they went to the beach, or they're going to the movies at 2 p.m. This is where you really start testing what you mean by freedom, because people will accept a generic idea. But then when it comes to being serious about serious work at a serious company, they'll say, wait a second, this is not a place for play. This excessive freedom on the one side is going to affect people somewhere else. And I think that's where the leap of faith is necessary when you say, can you run the risk of letting people make enormous decisions about themselves, about the product, about the quality, without central control? And our answer over the years has been, of course you can, because these people are committed. Why are they committed? They're committed because they have now a say. They have a substantial part normally of the profit as well. There's all kinds of incentives to be yourself, but that's not true when you just talk about generic freedom and everyone agrees and then you have nothing.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I love that distinction you're making. You know, at World Blue, when we talk about freedom at work, we say freedom does not mean a free for all. Freedom does not mean laissez-faire. You know, it's having those systems and processes in place that are done democratically. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. That gives that outcome. And I think you're right about that leap of faith. I think people also need to understand this isn't just some nice kumbaya idea. This actually delivers bottom line results. We had a third-party outside group look at companies that practice the freedom at work model that we teach at World Blue. And they found on average that companies that work this way, that work in a way that gives power to people, that, you know, it's not as hierarchical as command and control, average 700% greater revenue growth over a 3-year period compared to the S&P 500. So there's a real bottom line impact when companies work this way. So how do you do it? You know, how do you actually get this done? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So there's 3 things we're going to talk about today. What we have found, and let me just shift this a little bit here, our 3 secrets to accelerating growth with freedom at work is this. Number 1, this is what we're going to get into. You can transition from hierarchy to organizational democracy without feeling like you've lost all control as a leader. There is a way to do that. Of course, we're not saying I want to be clear, we're not saying that a company has to be completely flat. There's always a little bit of hierarchy in different ways. There's helpful hierarchy at times, and there's unnecessary hierarchy, and that's what we're talking about here. So there is a way to do that without feeling like you lose control, like you've been referencing, Ricardo, which is great. You can make the transition to a democratic style of leadership, even if you have no clue what you're doing, and we're going to talk about how. And you can bring your team along with you, even if they think it will never work. There is a way to do this, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get into that first secret. You can shift from organizational hierarchy to organizational democracy without losing control. Oh, okay, great. Well, how do you do it? How do you do it? Well, this is the question I was in when I first started World Blue, and I wanted to know, back to those college days, well, what exactly is democracy? I mean, if we were to ask people right now, I mean, I love going on the street when I travel all over the world, and I'll say, what is democracy to you? And people often say it means voting. And then I point out, well, they vote in North Korea. Does that mean it's democratic? No. You know, is it the Bill of Rights? Sometimes people will say, or is it choice, having choice? What exactly is democracy? So I did both my undergraduate and graduate research asking this question. And I'll skip over a lot of detail, but in the course of that research, what I found is that there are 10 principles that actually create a democratic system. And I say principles, not values. I think values can change, but principles, like the principles of math, don't change. And I've discovered and found what those 10 principles are. And then in the process of doing that, really started to think about, well, okay, if we want to help organizations operate in a democratic way, how do we create a benchmarking tool that evaluates if they're operating democratically or not? So my team and I, we took these 10 principles and we created a scorecard tool that actually measures the level of freedom and democracy in a company without being prescriptive on an individual leadership and systems and processes level. So when I first started out on this journey about 26 years ago, I thought, okay, great, we'll create that standard, and then we're going to help organizations democratize the way they get things done. And by creating that standard, what we did was we invited any company, as long as they had 10 employees or more, to apply to take our scorecard and ultimately get certified as a freedom-centered company. And that's kind of how we started World Blue, how we started building our community and what we do worldwide. And we had many companies from all over the world, from every industry that you can think of, apply and get certified as a freedom-centered company, which has been wonderful. We launched that back in 2007, and we're still certifying companies, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. So like I said, at first I thought, oh, well, can't we just go into companies and kind of rearrange the furniture and get their culture right? Is that going to work? But in the process of my team and I working with these hundreds and hundreds of companies around the world, I began to notice a couple key things that all of these top leaders did. The first thing I noticed was that they had a very different mindset from typical leaders, typical command and control leaders. Their mindset was all about freedom. Their mindset wasn't about fear. It was about breaking through fear. It was about breaking through limitation to get to that next level. And the second thing was their mindset, not just their mindset, but their leadership skills were different. They weren't trying to create a great environment, but still operating in this traditional hierarchical command and control style of leadership. They had taken the time to learn and develop distinctly democratic leadership skills. How do you listen? How do you have empathy? How do you create the conditions that bring out the best in people? How do you amplify a sense of worth in others? How do you help people awaken their power within? How do you create the conditions for everyone to be at their best? So there was a mindset, there was a leadership skills, and then the third piece was the organizational design. So then how do you design the systems and processes so that the way we get things done, as Ricardo was talking about at Semco, shifted from that hierarchical way to a much more decentralized and democratic way that actually treats people like adults. And in the process of doing this, we codified this into what we call the Freedom at Work strategy. So it gives us a strategy based on our work with hundreds and hundreds of companies from small to very large. The largest company that we've worked with has 150,000 employees. And we found that these 3 steps are what it takes to build that freedom-centered environment: mindset, leadership, and the freedom-centered design. And I want to talk a little bit more about this freedom-centered design piece, because this is where the principles of organizational democracy that I spent about a decade figuring out and researching come into play. What exactly do we mean when we say democracy? I mean, organizational democracy is that framework that gives you the outcome, which is freedom. So it's principles like accountability, transparency, integrity, decentralization of power, the balance of the individual and the collective, choice. These principles, when put into operation, are what create these robust systems and processes that can transform any organization, regardless of what industry it's in. So I've codified all this into my new book. Yep, here's a shameless plug for my new book, Freedom at Work. I invite you to check it out if you'd like. And in it, I talk about 50 different companies that have been certified and work this way. So from there, I want to tell you a really great story about a World Blue certified company called DaVita. Maybe some of you have heard of DaVita. They are a healthcare company. They are now at 52,000 employees. They've been a World Blue certified Freedom Center company since 2008. But they weren't always a freedom-centered company. In fact, they used to be a very fear-based company until Kent Theory, he goes by KT, came in and said KT is a Harvard MBA, and he was invited to come into DaVita, which used to be called Total Renal Care. Say that 10 times fast. Was invited to come in and help Total Renal Care at the time, which was on the edge of bankruptcy, under investigation from the SEC, and their top talent was jumping ship. They had to be turned around. And instead of him coming in with a slash and burn mentality, he says, we're going to come in and think of ourselves not just as some company, but as a democratic community first and as a company second. In fact, he stopped calling them a company and started to call them a village, and he called himself the mayor of the village de Vida. And he did many things to decentralize decision-making and decentralize power so that everyone could have a say and a voice and engage fully in the company and turning around the company. And he did something I think that's really, really cool. He actually created a bridge. This is a real bridge. I've had the opportunity to walk across it myself. And he said to his employees, when you're ready, when your head, heart, and hands are really ready to make that transition from operating in a fear and control-based leadership style to cross the bridge into a much more freedom-centered and democratic style, I invite you to walk across that bridge. And they would have this bridge at their different events, and people would symbolically cross it when they were ready to do so. And I've had the opportunity, like I said, to stand on the stage and cross the bridge with them, which is really special. And as a result of making that transition into a much more democratic model, they went from being on the edge of bankruptcy to being a $15 billion company now with 65,000 employees worldwide. So there's so many powerful ways that, again, by KT having a different mindset, different leadership skills, and helping to bring out that mindset and leadership skills with his people, and then creating systems and processes. I talk about this in depth in my book. That's what created this massive change. So that's secret number one, again, mindset, leadership, and design. So now let's look at our second secret. Our second secret is that you can transform the leadership style of your company without failing, even if you have no clue what you're doing. You can, whether you're at the top or you're running a team or you're a one-man band. Well, maybe not if you're a one-man band, but you can make this transformation. But what you have to do is address those internal things that might be trying to stop you. So Ricardo, what are your thoughts about what are sort of the internal gremlins that come up for people that you've seen in your experience that keeps leaders from moving forward in embracing this style?
And there's two aspects to that, Tracy. One is that you end up depending very much on the leader for that change. And my question is, and I think a lot of the work that we've tried to do is, how do we get companies and the people within them to be able to make these changes without waiting for or counting on leadership mentality? Because it's that much easier if you have someone at the very top who believes in this and then starts, let's say, empowering, and there's a lot of problems with that word, but basically distributing around the company the ability to change. But then you're stuck also with a leadership mentality that is that the companies depend upon, because then suddenly this person leaves and another person comes in and says, this hasn't worked, I don't like this, let's go back to clocking in, and suddenly you don't have something that's systemic and that stays long enough, and there's companies like Gore and Patagonia, and for a while there Body Shop, a lot of people who have tried to instill something in the long term. And then you'll have, let's say, the many wonderful years, let's say, of Ben and Jerry's, and then suddenly it'll be sold to a major corporation that suddenly puts in all kinds of restrictions again. So my answer to that is that it's with the very small opportunities that you give departments and people, et cetera, to declare freedom in their own little area. That's what makes the big change. And the other one is when you have information and transparency that is structurally available to all. And that's a very difficult one as well, because the boards and compliance and lawyers and auditors will all hold you back from distributing information, even though the risk is very remote. But if you're not able to distribute the real information, people are not really able to step into meetings and find that some majority of that will decide the meeting no matter what. You have a lot of cliches, or you have a lot of risk based upon only the leader's mentality. That's, to me, where we're stuck, I think.
I love how you said that, because you're absolutely right. How often do we have these wonderful visionary leaders who are building these freedom center companies, and then they leave and the whole thing falls apart, or they sell the company and the whole thing falls apart? And so how do you create those systems and processes? We have a wonderful company that's been World Blue certified called Equal Exchange. Maybe some of you know of them. They're a co-op. They have a constitution within their company that says, hey, no matter who the leader is, we're still going to work this way. That's a very advanced level way of doing things. And I love your point too about how do we have people claim that power within to have pockets of freedom at work or self-management within their companies. And there's certainly wonderful ways to do that. What we have found, just like you said, it's always easier if the top can get behind these ideas and move it forward. That's always the best scenario, the dream scenario. And what we found in working with a lot of business leaders from small to large that holds them back from making this transition within themselves is actually fear. It's the fear of failure. It's the fear of, like, I know KT went through this. He told me at DaVita, he said, Traci, I used to go back to my hotel room before he moved out to LA, where DaVita was. It's now in Denver. He says he would actually cry in his hotel room at night because he's like, I don't know. Are people going to come with me on this? Is this going to work? Am I making the right decision? What if people leave? What if I look like a fool? What if I fail? All of these questions, I think, hold leaders back from saying, we can make this transition. I know in my heart, I know in my gut, we need to make this transition. And so really, in a word, what we've seen in our experience is that 4-letter word that starts with an F, and it's fear. It's fear that holds these leaders back. So how do you break through that fear? How do you break through that fear of failure? The fear of, is this going to work or not? The fear of, what are my colleagues and employees going to think of me? What are the shareholders going to think of me? What are my stakeholders going to think if this doesn't work out? And so here's what we've discovered in the process. I had to go through this experience myself. I remember in my early 20s, I was dealing with a lot of fear in building World Blue, even in standing for these ideas, because there's not a lot of us out there who are standing for this way of working. And I remember one day calling up a mentor of mine and kind of spilling my heart out to her. And she says, Traci, I just have one question for you. I'm like, what? What's this one question? And she says, well, what would you do if you weren't afraid? How would you go forward if you weren't afraid? And instantly, I knew what I needed to do. I knew that I had to take action and move forward. And that question, what would you do if you weren't afraid? I've since called the power question, because when we are in fear, we're not in our power in the right way. But when we're coming from a place of purpose and wanting to help others and not being afraid, that's when we're back in our power. And so we've been able to teach many leaders around the world what we call the power question practice that can literally help shift your mindset. We talked about mindset from fear to freedom and possibility in a moment. And this is just an incredible tool that can also be used to get your team unstuck quickly. The CEO of WD-40, Gary Ridge, a World Blue certified Freedom Center company, took this practice once to his executive team on one of their retreats. They were stuck working on some major product stuff. And he took them through these 5 questions I'm about to teach you now, and it got them unstuck and moving forward. Literally, this practice can also make you millions and millions of dollars, because when we break through fear, we become unlimited and we get to that next level. So think about a fear that you're dealing with as you think about, gosh, can we do this or not? Or maybe you're already working this way, but you're ready to go to that next level. So the 5 questions we like to ask are, well, what is it that you're afraid of? A lot of times, again, people are afraid of, what will other people think of me? Am I good enough to have this succeed? Can this work? What will others think if it doesn't work? So what are you afraid of? Why are you afraid? Sometimes people are afraid because they haven't tried it before, or they saw somebody else do it, but maybe it didn't work, or, so there's lots of reasons why we're afraid. And then here's the key question. So what would you do if you weren't afraid? Would you embrace this style? Would you help yourself develop and grow more if you weren't afraid to go to that next level? How would you feel without the fear? I think we'd all feel a lot lighter and a lot more energy. I know I always do. When I shake off the fear, I feel a lot more energy. And last, why is it okay to let the fear go? And let me give you an example of how this was put into practice. So one of our World Blue certified Freedom Center companies is called HCL Technologies. Maybe you've heard of them. They're based out of India, outside of Delhi. had the opportunity to visit them, and it's just an incredible company. And a number of years ago, Vineet Nair was their CEO. He's actually written a fabulous book about how they work. And they completely flipped that corporate pyramid from the command and control hierarchy to a much more democratic model. They have 150,000 employees. This is obviously not everybody in this picture I grabbed of them. They have 150,000 employees, publicly traded, multinational company. And they were operating democratically, and we were working with them, and they were doing great. But they hit a major bump in the road during a recessionary time. And Vineet, their CEO at the time, realized that they were going to have to make some serious changes, or serious changes that would save them $100 million, or they would have to let people go. So as many leaders, we have these moments, especially when it comes to financial things, that we get gripped with fear. And what are we going to do? How are we going to break through that fear? Well, what Vineet did was he asked himself the power question: what would I do if I weren't afraid? How would I solve this problem if I weren't afraid? And instead of doing what a lot of us do when we're afraid, which is, go into the cave and kind of be like, everybody leave me alone, I'm just going to have to solve this problem on my own. He opened up, he became transparent, and he found through their internal communication systems, he decided to let everybody in the company know, guess what, guys? We have got to find a way to save $100 million, or we're going to have to let people go. All right, friends. Okay, team, do you have ideas for what we can do? They had over 200 ideas come in, and Vineet and his team looked at those ideas, quickly thought through, okay, what can we implement? What can we not? They ended up implementing 72 of the ideas. And instead of saving $100 million, they saved $260 million, and no one was let go. And that's all because Vineet decided to confront his fear and say, if I weren't afraid, I would go to my team. I'd invite all of us to solve this problem together. And they did. And look at that extraordinary outcome they achieved. So when we as leaders handle the fear, that's when we really can move forward in making this work. Okay, so let's look at our next secret, our third and final secret, which is, yes, you can bring your team along with you, even if they think it won't work, and even if you feel like you're up against a lot of external factors that are trying to slow you down. So, Ricardo, love to hear your thoughts on sort of external things that try to keep leaders from making this transition from command and control to a more decentralized democratic model. What are your thoughts?
Let me also add that on your comment before of how to deal with the downturn in those situations. When we had a situation like that, which was drastic, and it was a market to an extent, a very bad business environment in the country and so forth. But we called all our people together and we talked to them, and we had a big powwow in the plant itself. And a very interesting thing that came up was this: the blue collar workers and the people who were really on the front line, they said, we can fix this, or we can help you fix this, but the way you guys run things around here, there's such an enormous amount of waste that we couldn't even start. And what would be our incentive to really fix this? And I proposed something. I said, let's do the following. We at that time, everything was checks and signing checks. And we said, the workers are, if you want, it can be the union, it doesn't matter. You get one signature and we get one signature, so that no checks are signed anymore if they don't have both signatures on it for a year. And let's see what happens. And it was radical. They immediately stopped all kinds of third-party services and said, we can do that ourselves. This truck company has been cheating you for years. We can do this for much less. This work that people started doing multiple jobs, saying, I don't have to be only at this machine like the union says. I can do this, but in the afternoon I can do that. I can do the cleaning around this. And it made a major change. But it was only when they were one of the two signatures on the check that the group of workers finally said, okay, well, we have power on the check, then we'll move. It was very interesting. So it again says, if you want to clock people on their productivity, if you want to watch and monitor and control and have rules, people are going to work by the book or by some format that they say, well, this is what the company wants, I'll just do it. But if you ask them, said, would you do this yourself? They say, heck no. And that's I think when was a wonderful change. On the external side, I think that people will fall back to the issue of my board and the board to the investors and to the funds and to the stock market to say that all of these have very great restrictions. We had over the years several 50-50 joint ventures for South America with Fortune 500 companies who were not only humongous, but had all of these external concerns. And they'd come and say, but, we need compliance. We need our legal people, our HR people. And I said, can you give us a year in which you don't send these people down and we don't send reports and then we go? So I think we could put right into the contract that it's a year. Okay. And during that year, we did it our way. And in three of the cases with these Fortune 500, we ended up being in their annual convention, their award system, the company of the year, the highest productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And then when that came, I said, can we get another year where you don't give us a hard time and we can do this again? And in one of the companies, we went 23 years without them ever having any contact with the U.S. Central, the headquarters with HR, compliance, finance, nothing. And they were kind of going at it blindly, saying, I hope we're never going to have a problem with compliance. But in the 23 years, we didn't. So it was a good way to remember that the external part has solutions as well if you try temporary solutions that work.
I love that. I'm so glad you brought out those external factors and also what you all have done to make it work. I remember talking with Gary Ridge, the CEO of WD-40 again, and publicly traded company, and I said, how did you kind of hold everybody back with all the pressure when he helped transition WD-40 into a much more decentralized and democratic model? And he says, sometimes you just really have to hold the line on it. You just have to hold the line and say, this is going to work, and show people that it can work. And I think that is one of the biggest problems is people they're willing to do it too if there's a pathway. Like, is there a roadmap? And I think a lot of times leaders who may not know about Semco Style Institute or World Blue, they're kind of taking a DIY ad hoc approach to this. And so then you have all the pressure of, is this going to work? Is it not? Well, I don't know. Are these proven strategies? Are there other people in the community? Is there a community of people you can gather with? Because usually we're stronger when we're together and we have courage and we get confidence when we talk with other people who have done this. So here's what we found at World Blue in the process. How do we make this basically bulletproof? Is there a way to make it bulletproof? Now, of course, there's no way you can 100% guarantee that this process of shifting from hierarchy to a much more democratic model can work for a company. But what I will tell you is, in our experience being at this for almost 30 years now, is that when you follow a process, it actually works. And every single company that we've worked with that follows the roadmap that we figured out has succeeded. Every single one of them. None of them have failed. And here's what we've discovered. It's actually quite simple. We call it the Freedom at Work roadmap. You assess your company, you create that benchmark so that you know where you are in the process. If you don't know where you are in making that transition, how are you going to know what to do? How are you going to know how to get better? How are you going to know what to focus on? You quite simply don't. So you assess your company, you train your leaders in a democratic style of leadership, and then you design those systems and processes. We have found through third-party research that 75% of our culture is actually created by the systems and processes that we have in place. So by getting those systems and processes, in other words, how you get stuff done, transformational practices, best practices, how you do it, which Ricardo's talked about with Semco, how they've transitioned. When you get those in place, and you trained people in those democratic skills, and you understand what the benchmark is, those 3 steps, this actually works and it's sustainable over the long term. Here's how we do it at World Blue. Step 1, we have companies take our Freedom at Work scorecard, like we talked about, that measures the level of freedom and democracy on those 10 principles that we talked about at an individual leadership and systems and processes level. So we create the benchmark with our Freedom at Work scorecard. Step 2, we have our Lead with Freedom program. And this is where we develop leaders to specifically have the skills of democratic leadership and how to have a fearless mindset. And step 3 is our Grow with Freedom program, where we develop democratic systems and processes for companies. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of proven democratic best practices from our World Blue certified companies that we've worked with that we know work. And so what we do is we work with companies to help customize and personalize those best practices in a way that helps get them to that next level. So when you have a clear roadmap, I think that helps take away that external fear and pressure when you can communicate to those external stakeholders or shareholders or investors, hey, there is a pathway that we're on for how to actually make this work. So if you don't skip any of these steps, what we have found, you will succeed. But if you do skip some of these steps or skip some of the principles, it really gets to be a bumpy ride. Let's give you an example of how this has worked. We had the great privilege of working with a company called Boost. They're a small company, about 15 to 20 employees down in New Zealand. They implemented the Freedom at Work roadmap, which we told you about, and Freedom at Work. And their CEO, Nathan Donaldson, told us that in just 1 year, they grew from over 64%, 1.4 million, to over 2.3 million in revenue. And their turnover dropped from 40% down to 20% because of Freedom at Work. We've had the privilege of working with a great company called Nearsoft, now Nearsoft and Cora in Mexico. Maybe some of you know them, Matt Perez. And we began working with them, and very quickly, they grew 12x as a result of Freedom at Work. I love this story. This is a company called DreamHost out in LA. We taught them how to implement these democratic systems and processes to grow their company. And then what they did was they applied them to their spinoff company called Ink Tank. And because they already had figured out these democratic systems and processes, they were able to grow their spinoff from 0 to $175 million sale in just 24 months. So again, this whole idea of a much more freedom-centered democratic approach to leadership and organizational design really is scalable, and it accelerates growth. And last, one more example from our wonderful WD-40. Again, according to Gary Ridge, our CEO, our sales quadrupled and our market cap increased from $250 million to over $2 billion as a result of Freedom at Work. So all of these companies are World Blue certified companies, and they're all practicing these exact wonderful ideas that we've been talking about. So let's recap before we get into our Q&A here. All right, how do we accelerate growth with freedom rather than fear and control in the workplace? Secret 1, you can shift from organizational hierarchy to organizational democracy without losing control with the 3-step Freedom at Work strategy, like we talked about, mindset, leadership, and organizational design, or like strategies that Semco Style also has for you. Secret 2 is you can make the transition without fear, even if you have no clue what you're doing, by using the power question practice. If you continue to break through fear as you implement these ideas, you will succeed. And secret 3, you can bring your team along with you and even make the process almost completely bulletproof if you use the Freedom at Work roadmap. We have seen it happen over and over again. Again, here's my book, shameless plug. Invite you to check it out. There's over 100 best practices for how to practice these ideas in your organization, beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. So now you've made it to the end, and we have a few special gifts for you. Gift number 1, in case you didn't know, Ricardo and I will be live in person with a bunch of other incredible CEOs, all talking about how you build freedom center workplaces at our summit coming up in Miami, Florida in February 28th and 29th. Escape the cold. If you're up north, escape the cold. Come to us in Miami. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, well, continue your summer. Come on up. We would love to have you join us. You know, here's the deal, guys. We know everybody's busy. We know resources are tight, but when we come together, that's how we build this movement. That's how we actually start to shift the needle and help more and more companies learn how to operate this way. We teamed up with Semco Style Institute to bring you this summit. And so what we're offering to those of you who signed up for this webinar is for 1 week only, and you will be getting an email on this for 1 week only. If you buy a business class or first class ticket with us, our theme is Take Flight. That's why it's called business class, first class. If you buy one of those tickets, you will get a free premium class ticket with us to the summit. It's valued at about $2,000. You don't have to buy a business class or first class ticket. You could just get the premium class ticket. But here we are at the end of the year. If you have some resources you need to use up, now is the opportunity. And if you're ready to kick off 2024 with an incredible, inspiring lineup of speakers that are going to share best practices with you that you can immediately implement in your team, you're going to want to come to the summit. This is our 11th summit. It's our first time teaming up with Semco Style Institute, and we're so excited that Ricardo will be there as well, giving a wonderful keynote. So we're looking forward to seeing all of you there. And then our second special gift we have for you is any of you that are in a company with 10 or more employees, we invite you to apply for our annual World Blue List of Freedom-Centered Workplaces Award. This is our annual award that we give recognizing companies that work this way. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, we don't need an award. We don't want to brag about ourselves, or we don't want to toot our own horn. Why do we need an award? Well, the thing is, when we're able to recognize the incredible work that you're doing, we're able to tell your story and inspire more leaders to work this way. Sometimes we get really focused on just thinking about ourselves and what's in it for me. And I want to invite you, whether it's thinking about the summit, don't just think about what can I get out of it? What can you come and bring? Maybe you already work this way. What can you come and bring and inspire others to do? When you think about operating your company this way, maybe you're knocking it out of the park. Well, let's not be selfish and keep that to ourselves. Let's share your story with others. I mean, imagine if Ricardo had gone with his incredible team and built Semco into what it is and never told their story. And Ricardo said, I'm not going to write a book. I'm not going to spend all that time. I'm not going to tell the story a million times like you have, Ricardo. What if Ricardo just kept that to himself? None of us would be on this call today. None of us would feel as inspired as we are. So if you have a wonderful culture, or you want to have this kind of a culture, we invite you to apply for the award. If you don't hit the standard, it's fine. It's confidential. We're not going to tell anybody. But if you do, that brings us together so that we can have collective freedom, defeating collective fear. We are stronger together, and we invite you to apply. So for 1 week only, we'll take 10% off the application fee. We have to charge an application fee because, number one, what we're offering is valuable. And number two, I've spent 20 years building these tools, and we're making it easy and accessible for you now. So again, we're stronger together than we are apart. And we really hope that you'll consider joining our world list of freedom-centered workplaces and our incredible community of companies we have worldwide. So with that, let's get into some Q&A. So my wonderful colleague, Miranda, who's our COO and one of our master coaches, is going to be facilitating our Q&A. If you have a question, please now type it into chat. She'll read out your question. If she sees that there's some questions that are related, she's going to bring those together. And you can direct your questions directly to Ricardo or to me or to both of us. And we'll go from there. So Miranda, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Traci. In fact, there's one that's just come in from Brian, which I'm going to go straight to. And there are some previous ones, but this one's quite relevant and I want to get to it. Brian says, hi, Ricardo. I'm intrigued by how Semco lets employees determine their base salaries. But how does Semco determine the amount of money that's available for base salaries? Is there a base salary pool that's some function of the company's revenue or net income? I'm reimagining salaries right now at our company, Labyrinth Learning, and would appreciate any input anyone might give on how to handle this in a democratic manner.
Well,
So
Brian,
that's go ahead.
Brian, the rationale is basically this, that what determines a salary in first place? And to me, it has 5 components, 3 of which we know, and 2 we know nothing about. The first is, what do people make inside the company? So we started by simply publishing all of the salaries from lowest to highest. Second, what do people make somewhere else? And so we publish results of what people would make at another company. And three, what can the company afford? So we would take the salary base as a percentage of revenue and a number and say, this is what we spend on payroll as a whole. And there are two things that we know nothing about, which is what would the person like to be making at this point in their life? And we know nothing, and we don't get that information. And lastly, what does this person compare to when they look at their spouse, their neighbor, their ex-college mates, et cetera, et cetera. And there you put in what's the TV they'd rather have bought and what's the car they would have liked to change to. So either we get these two from them and we do all kinds of Freudian analysis with them on what they want in their lives, or we give them the first three. So we gave them the first three from the very start, and we said, now you have between these five things, you're perfectly able to set the right salary because you know how much we spend on salaries, you know what everyone here makes, what you would make somewhere else. There's no information lacking for you. There's no way you could be wrong about your salary. And so it's interesting that we've never had a bad experience with that. But again, the assumption is that you're going to give out this information so that the person has whatever it takes to determine what their salary should be.
Great, thanks, Ricardo. Okay, so let's take a look at others that we've got here. So Colin says, I read Maverick some years ago and more recently the 7-Day Weekend. I was very impressed by both. However, what are your views on the modern monetary theory and universal basic income, UBI being funded by sovereign money? So that was the first question that actually came in from Colin. And yeah, give us your views on that, Ricardo.
When you leave the world of the corporate function, you go into society in general, and you think about what are the formats, the economic formats that could undo some of this very distressing distribution of income, which is dramatically bad everywhere in the world, here in the US, certainly in the southern cone most everywhere, in Asia and Africa, et cetera. And it's better only in Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands, et cetera, but it's also not solved, let's say, in any respect. UBI and all kinds of other formats which say we need to set a safety net at the very bottom to keep people from becoming homeless or becoming completely alienated from the economic system, to me has always made sense. It's kind of just very basic rationale, the same way as public hospitals. I don't understand, for example, in the US here, you have public schools, but I don't understand why you don't have public universities. The whole idea that you have to be saddled with thousands and thousands and thousands and dozens of thousands of debt, which you're going to take until you're 40 years to repay in a system that funds public K-12. Why doesn't it fund public universities? So there are questions like that all over the world, which are different every country you go to, but which all hark back to the issue of what is this basic tax system meant to cover? And if you say it's meant to cover education, some basic housing abilities, and so forth, then it's obvious that having a minimal income, which you don't go below in any situation, seems to me the very obvious solution. And I think you'll, in the contrary of Traci's blue approach, you'll have all the red people who are going to say, these are just bums that should be working, should be out there, and I made my own money my way, and I was working for McDonald's when I was 9 years old. This is what we're going to hear all over. But the situation is, of course, there are lots of people who are shoved into family situations, and single mothers and guys who've lost jobs one after the other, et cetera, and don't have the wherewithal to do well in such a capitalist society. The idea of having a universal minimum payout, dole out from the system to people who can make it seems to me a very easy thing to defend compared to the idea that we should be increasing all of the time this Calvinist approach of work hard, survive, do everything you need to do, it's very unfair. There's a lot of people who are not interested nor qualified to survive in a very capitalist mode, which is already pretty cruel as it is.
Thanks, Ricardo. We've got loads of questions coming in, and to be fair, I'm going to pass one over to Traci now, and we will get to all of them. So Traci, Hannah asks, Traci, totally agree on how critical mindset is to this way of working and being in organizations. Do you have any examples where you've worked with leaders that have been resistant, fearful, cynical, and how you help them to see the light?
Yeah, almost every leader you work with is resistant and cynical in some way, even those who are like, yeah, we want to do this. So yes, and really it's using that power question practice that I talked about. If you try to convince them, logically, we've talked logically today, we've talked about the bottom line impact, we've shared stories of success, but you really have to go deep into figuring out what the fear is that's holding them back. The other thing I'll say that I forgot to mention earlier that is incredibly vitally important is this. People often come to us and they say, so is there any situation where freedom at work will not work? And we say, yes, there is one situation where it will not work. And it won't work if the top leadership of a company or the top leader, for example, has low self-worth, okay? If that top leader or the leadership team is not secure in who they are, this will not succeed. Let me flip it a different way. So one of the 3 leadership traits that we teach, 3 attributes of a freedom-centered leader, one of those attributes is you have to have high self-worth. Now, self-worth is different from confidence. Confidence is situational. Self-worth does not mean you're perfect. It does not mean you're a narcissist. It does not mean you're not still learning and growing, but it's being secure in who you are. So at World Blue, we talk about on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your level of self-worth and why? We have found that leaders who can give themselves about an 8 or higher, this is not scientific, it's anecdotal, but we have found that leaders who have that higher self-worth or, and this is important, may have low self-worth but are willing to work on it. If they're willing to do that, then they can build these kinds of companies. The reason why self-worth is so important is because you have to be secure enough in who you are. You can see it in Ricardo. Ricardo's a wonderful, secure leader. He can take the feedback. He can hear the criticism if something doesn't work or, we need to change something. He's not going to take that as a personal attack. A high self-worth leader isn't going to take that as a personal attack. They're going to take feedback as an opportunity to grow. High self-worth leaders also want to create the conditions where others can be at their best, where others can flourish and realize their fullest potential. But if a leader is insecure in themselves, they're going to find this way of working extremely threatening, and it will not work. So your 2 biggest things you have to do when you're dealing with leaders who are cynical or skeptical or just aren't interested is you have to address the fear in their thinking, and then you have to look at that level of self-worth. There you go.
Great, thanks, Traci. Okay, we're going to go to, because I've had a few people say, please, can you make sure my question gets asked? We're going to go to Matthias and then to Carlos. So Matthias said, as you articulated, a transformation always starts with a mature leader. Did you face challenges with leaders who only look at the numbers but don't have the mindset and maturity and want to do the transformation for the profit? If yes, how do you mitigate this challenge? From discussions with transformation experts, the limit of transformation and the achievable maturity is capped by the leader. Would you agree, Ricardo?
Well, there's a question there for both of us, but starting with the second part of it, I always think that depending on a leader and depending on their self-reliance and self-esteem and the ability to do that is of course a remote and ideal situation. But having the ability to make change, disconsidering that, is even better. And so the format I found is this, that the system is set up. When you think about stock exchange, you think about investors, you think about boards. It is set up very clearly to monetary results. And so if you're able to focus on showing that you can do that, you can sell more widgets, you can make more per item, et cetera, that usually takes the day. And so if you say I have 11 people here in my little area, and I don't, I'm not going to get any authorization from management to do anything very different. I would do these baby steps of saying, look, I'm going to do a few things here, and let's just see what happens with the numbers. But so I'm going to take my salespeople, and I don't want them to clock in anymore. I don't want to know which days they're working. I'm starting to do things here. And slowly, as you necessarily will have better results of that, you come back and say sales are up 11%. They don't have to be up 700, but they're up 11%. The absent days, et cetera, have gone down so many percent. And then any kind of manager at the next level, be it level 12 in the organization of the pyramid, et cetera, doesn't matter. We'll look at it and say, oops, well, let's give it a little bit more leeway because it's working. And so I think that this osmosis that comes from baby steps is the other format if you don't have the mentality of a person with self-esteem at the top who's willing to take risks.
Yeah, and I would just say, to clarify, we actually don't say self-esteem because esteem means an estimate of oneself. Sorry, Ricardo, but we talk about self-worth. And I love your point about taking those baby steps. Those are those systems and processes that you can put into place. And that works in a big company, but sometimes in those smaller companies, what we have found time and time again is when leaders are they're not confident, they don't feel that self-worth. It's very, very, very challenging for them to go along for the ride with this. I love this approach that you can take baby steps. If they're open to the baby steps, absolutely, that's what you do. And you can appeal to the logic of that bottom line. But sometimes we have just found it's just a bridge too far. And even appealing to the logic and the bottom line, it doesn't work. So you just have to try it from different angles. You try it from what Ricardo's saying, you try it from what I'm talking about, try it from different angles. The bottom line is, do we get there? And we just want to get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one from Carlos. Let me see where I am. Traci, can you talk and distinguish between the definition of a democratic leader from conscious leadership, and why we maybe don't use the narrative of human consciousness?
Yeah, Carlos, I think there's a lot of different words that are very synonymous for democratic leadership. I don't know what your definition is of conscious leadership. I'm not an expert in that. But I do think that when we are operating in a way that recognizes the full potential of every person, that recognizes treating people as adults rather than children, as Ricardo says so beautifully, that is a very conscious style of leadership. I'm specifically saying democratic leadership as a style of leadership that is all about awakening the power within people and making sure that everyone has a voice and a say in how things are done within a structure that is highly democratic. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's just, I'm not as familiar with that phrase. Democratic leadership is where I put my focus.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Traci. Okay, so this next one is kind of covering several questions that have all come in of a similar theme. So could you take a moment to talk about how you communicated when you first got started, Ricardo, and how you communicated with people so that they could coordinate? And are there any systems and channels that you used to enable that coordination to happen? And then the other two-part to that is how, motivation goes up and down. How do you keep people motivated, especially when you know that change can often take time?
Yeah, the degree of motivation to make these changes, especially if you're going along baby steps, is pretty easy because the ones before are working, and you know that you'll have a long-term motivation. But the other one, how do people motivate themselves on Monday morning? We used to have one question only for the first 15 years. We had only one question on the employee survey, which was anonymous, was give me a grade between 0 and 10 of how motivated you feel to jump out of bed on Monday morning to come to work. And that's the only thing we worked with, because that's enough to resolve and to answer every other question of an employee survey. And if you're setting your own time, you're determining your kind of work, you're determining how much you're going to work, what your salary is going to be. There's no difficulty in continuing motivation, because as you become less motivated with that particular task or that format, etc., you're very free to move to another one that motivates you more. So that's an easy solution over long term for not losing, let's say, motivation as you go along, because the freedom that is available to you to change should be enough. And I think the first part, Miranda, was more for Traci to answer, right?
Do you want to say that part again, Miranda?
Yeah, so the first part was how would you communicate with people so that they can coordinate any particular systems and processes around that? And then how do you keep people motivated? Because change is hard.
So how do you communicate? And then
Yeah.
how do you keep people motivated? Well, I think you have to take the principle of transparency. And what you do is you adapt that principle. And we have a lot of different practices for how to do that in a way that makes sense for the size and scope and goals of your company's culture. So there's a lot of different ways to communicate transparently. There's lots of tools out there that can help do that. Ricardo talked earlier about how absolutely important it is that you do have that information flowing to employees. Employees can't operate democratically if they don't have good, accurate, timely information. It just doesn't work. And then the second part, Miranda, was how do you keep people motivated?
Yeah.
We've found that most people are motivated to work in these kinds of environments because they want to be treated like an adult. No, it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. And we do recognize that. But what we have found is that when companies are building these systems and processes, whether it's starting with the basics such as core values and purpose and vision, or it's building more advanced systems and processes like we've talked about today and how employees help determine their own salary, when an individual is excited because they do have a sense of control of their own destiny, which is the only thing we can really control is ourselves, people get excited about that. Now, for individuals that this isn't exciting to them or it's not motivating, some people really prefer to work in a command and control hierarchy. Some people like that better, and that's just fine. So what we tell a lot of our wonderful companies that we work with is when you start to make this transition, it's not going to be for everyone. But the people who are excited about this, it's really not hard to motivate them. It just kind of comes from within because they're getting that deeper sense of ownership and purpose and alignment between their individual sense of purpose and the way the company works.
Yeah. Thanks, Traci.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next one. So Walter asks, how can you make the methodology more accessible and distributed from college students to startups and media and large corporations? Good question.
I mean, it's not a cultural issue. It's not a size issue. It's not an industry issue. Over time, we get all kinds of feedbacks from people in different walks of life. But we've seen schools and universities in Belgium. We've seen the police department of Amsterdam. We've seen just an enormous amount of variety. I think when you say, well, is it that easy to get a government branch to change, et cetera? I think it's all about these baby steps. It's getting a small department to be doing something slightly different in which you liberate people a little bit and you prove that it's smarter to do it that way, or it's more productive if it's a government situation, or it's more profitable if it's a corporate situation. And that should be enough to be able to move on. And to Traci's point about some people being adaptable or not, in our case, we've always thought that setting up a blueprint and an architecture of freedom to choose means that some people will choose to do things in a more disciplined fashion or more connected to time. And those people who want and feel better working like that will gravitate toward this area of the company that had the freedom to choose the way they want to do it. So it's different from saying that we have a central ideology and that you either submit to that or leave and go do this somewhere else. It's more that freedom entails being as free-spirited and as disciplined as you like, or the people around you like, and it doesn't make any difference because we were not determining that the right ideology is this one or that one.
I love how you said that, Ricardo. It's really important. People do have that choice, and it's not, oh, this is this hard and fast ideology. You're invited to come along on the journey, and for some people they want to, and some people they don't. And I just saw, Miranda, the question pop up from Amanda that I think relates to this. Yes. Amanda says, when you say it's not for everyone, does that mean we would have to let many people go during the transition process? No, you don't have to let anybody go. You don't have to let anybody go. Some people we have found, it's shocking. I know they just don't want to work this way, and that's fine. Some people, they've come to us and they said, you know what, I just want to go to work, get a paycheck, keep my head down and do what I'm told. I'm exhausted. I have children at home. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And that's totally fine. But no, you don't have to let anybody go through this process. We've never had that happen, that we come in and say, oh, you have to let a bunch of people go. Never said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. This next one, I think this is from David, and I think what he's getting at is.
Miranda, I'm sorry to interrupt. The gentleman who asked the previous question too, sorry, about how to get this into schools, universities. Yeah. Sorry, I do want to answer this. We would like to do that as well. I think, Ricardo has his 2 books. He's working on his 3rd book right now. I have my book that I know both of our books and materials, Ricardo's written many articles. He has wonderful articles in the Harvard Business Review. I've written many articles and publications as well. I think that's a great way to start, is getting our books into the universities. We're working at Worldview right now on a program to get this more accessible to universities. And if you have any ideas, we would love to know what they are. So thanks. Sorry, Miranda, back to you.
Thanks, Traci. And you just took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say, please get in touch with this, because we're always open to conversation about getting this out there more. Okay, so back to questions. We had one here from David, and I think what he's getting at is, do you think there's a degree of democracy that people can tolerate depending on their culture, background, that can kind of influence how much more ownership they take on at work?
Ricardo?
I mean, our experience over different countries and sizes, et cetera, is that there are initial cultural obstacles, of course, and that people will come at this with more reserve. And this has been our experience, for example, with this. And we thought it would be tremendous, the resistance in Japan, for example, when we started with an office in Kyoto with a local partner there. And we were surprised to find that there were a huge amount of small and medium-sized Japanese companies that were fed up with the whole idea of company first and submission and so forth. So my experience has been that culture can delay you a little bit, but that human nature in general is not a cultural constraint, and that people will go for freedom whenever they have that choice, wherever they are.
That's right.
I agree 100% with what Ricardo said. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you got time for maybe one more, Miranda. One more question.
Oh, we've got some really juicy ones here. I'm going to go to a practical one, and I think it will also help kind of bring everything back together. Brian says, do you do any type of employee reviews, any ways of rating employee performance that can affect base salaries or bonuses, while he figures out all of that piece? So over to you on that.
Ricardo, your thoughts on employee reviews? Yeah.
The simple solution to that for us has always been an anonymous 360 from the people who work around, above, below, etc. And we had, I think, a 34 question multiple choice format, which everyone filled in, and which just gave very simple answers about how much that person would be missed if they weren't there anymore, how effective their work is, etc. And then, because you give it out to the people around them, there's the self-evaluation of that as well. And then there's people on top and the bottom, etc. You end up with maybe, let's say, 10, 15, 18 of these and an average grading. and we had a cutoff that was problematic below 75 points out of 100 and so forth. And dropping below 80 as a leader puts you in jeopardy of continuing in a leadership position. So we set some places and some place marks that people would follow. And because all of this was anonymous, you knew immediately what the real story was on everybody very easily.
Wonderful. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being with us. And thank you to Ricardo Semler. What an honor and privilege to get to work with you on this webinar. Really looking forward to sharing the stage with you and looking forward to seeing all of you, if you can, join us at the Freedom at Work Summit. We would love to see you there. Thanks again so much for being with us, for your participation, and for your love of freedom at work. We look forward to seeing you soon. If you have any questions, shoot us a note. Contact us on LinkedIn. We are here to answer your questions. Thanks so much. Bye for now.